Well, if I said a few things yesterday that might have offended a few of you, I don't apologize, but I try to do my best today to offend the rest of you if I can. So we'll see how we do here. But I want to continue our discussion on what it means to have a culturally intelligent ministry mindset. And yesterday, I very briefly attempted to do that from a theological, missiological, anthropological perspective, really just touching on those disciplines very briefly. And today I want to spend our time looking more specifically at a sociological or humanitarian, or what we might call in our circles a mission or missions perspective, and want to try to give you a few what I would call imperatives, some hooks, if you will. So I want to be a little bit more practical today, and I don't by any means, in saying that, want to allude to the fact that thinking theologically is not practical. It definitely is. But I want to try to give you some things that would be real-life examples for you to try to think through and process together during our time, and maybe some of that will come out in the questions in a few moments. Let me start by telling you a story. My wife is from South Jersey, and we met a little over 10 years ago now in South Africa. And after we had decided that it was time for us to become BFFs and commit ourselves to each other a little bit more, she decided it was high time that she told her family all about this guy that she met in South Africa. And she has 3 younger brothers. They're not young, they're kind of old now, but she has 3 younger brothers, one of whom is in the SWAT team. And so I was expecting a little bit of pushback, maybe some waterboarding or something like that from those guys, but they were really cool. But when she told them that she was interested in the guy from South Africa, there was this kind of awkward silence on the other side of the phone, and when she told them this guy's name is Darryl, there were some half questions like, just, you know, is he, you know, is he kind of, well, you know, is he black? And so we had some fun with that. We photoshopped some pictures and sent them some pictures of her standing next to King Shaka Zulu in his loincloth with his spear and his shield and everything. And she's like, hey, what do you guys think? And, you know, we had some fun with that for a while. But I still get some interesting questions from time to time from people who ask, you know, oh, were your parents missionaries? Is that how come you know, white? Or things like, were you actually born there, as opposed to, I guess, being FedExed in at a later stage or something like that? I'm not sure, but it does speak to the fact that perception is reality for us. So your perception of what you think Africa is, it becomes your reality of a continent that is very rich in its heritage and very diverse, 54 countries, almost 1 billion people. So here's the question for you. What does an American look like? Like you? Like me? What does an American look like? Time magazine did an interesting cover a few years ago talking about the changing face of American society, a lot of that due to immigration and also interracial marriages and things like that, which speaks to the fact that the way in which people might perceive a typical American, North American to look like is perhaps not what some people actually think it is. And I think this actually speaks to the importance of this first imperative that I want to talk to you about this morning, and that is our demographic imperative. I spoke to you yesterday about Professor Soong-Chan Rah. Wrote an intriguing book a few years ago called The Next Evangelicalism, and in that book he shared some startling statistical realities that I think we as a church need to be very cognizant of today. And I want to share some of those statistics with you very briefly. The first one is quite important because it speaks to the fact that after the year 1965, that was when the change in the immigration laws occurred that allowed for non-European immigration into the US. So prior to that, all, if not most, of the immigration that occurred came from European countries, from places like Ireland and England and other countries like that. But the laws began to change, and we saw a huge influx of non-white immigrants, especially from countries like India and from the Far East, China, etc. But the two statistics that I want you to pay careful attention to, and why it's really relevant to you as the students of today, is that in just 8 years' time, 2023, of all the children that are born in the US, 50% of those will be amongst what we call so-called minority groups, 1 in 2. Okay, and just a short while after that, 2042, when you are in the midst of your careers, the US minority population will be more than 50%, giving us no clear majority in terms of one cultural, racial group, ethnic group over against another. It will truly be a melting pot society. So what does that mean? What does this mean for places like this? Places where I teach, places where you are currently learning. I believe that it means, for one thing, that we need to ensure as educators that you are being prepared to live, work, and minister and appreciate the world in which you're going to be living over the next 50 years. During the time of your career, we must not prepare you to be obsolete. We must not prepare you to be irrelevant to the society in which you are going to engage in. A society that simply does not exist anymore. The shift in demographics is as exciting to me personally as it is scary to some other people, and it often elicits a lot of other conversations regarding politics, immigration, and such. But here's the reality, here's the bottom line. Like it or not, it is the reality, and you need to live and learn to become a culturally intelligent individual in a world that is much smaller and much more connected and much more diverse than ever before. Your society, your country, your people. So if you are not prepared for that, then I think you're going to face some difficulties. And maybe you should ask for your money back. No, I'm just kidding. But we need to ensure that we're preparing you for that world, not the world that has come before us. Now, the next imperative that I want to talk to you about really is very connected to that as we think about demographics, and that is what I alluded to a moment ago, and that is the globalization, or some call it the glocalization imperative. This phenomenon has been fueled by the rise of social media that has changed the way in which people communicate today. Some of you may even find it hard to believe that Facebook only started in 2004. Twitter only started in 2007. I mean, what in the world did we do with our thumbs prior to those times? I don't know, maybe we went on MySpace. But a few years ago, a man by the name of Clay Shirky wrote a book called Here Comes Everybody. Now, he's an interesting guy because he's a social scientist, if you will. He's actually more engaged with emerging technologies and of open source software systems. And in this fascinating book he wrote called Here Comes Everybody, he spends a lot of time talking about ways in which collaboration is occurring today across nationalities and across geographical spaces because of technology. Social media being one of those things. But it does have its downfalls. It means that we, as a society that is saturated with this connectiveness, need to be intelligent in the way in which we maneuver in that new space, in that new world, that for many of you sitting here today, that's been the only world that you've known, really, by and large, since you were at least a teenager, if not before. And so a helpful case study, I think, to talk about for a few moments is the story of Justine Sacco. Now, raise your hand if you've heard of Justine Sacco. Anyone? Okay, let me tell you the story of Justine. Now, Justine was like just any other 30-something on her way around the world today. Just like anyone who is traveling she was doing what everyone does when they travel, and that is tweet every thought that comes into her head as she went along. She was working for a PR firm in New York City, and she was on vacation traveling from JFK in New York to Cape Town International in South Africa via London, Heathrow. And along the way, she made a number of statements on Twitter talking about the airports and the crowds and the people and all that kind of thing. And then just before she boarded the plane, or just as she boarded the plane and was about to take off and turn off her phone and enjoy the rest of the 11-hour flight, she sent out this tweet. Now, she made this statement and turned off her phone and proceeded to enjoy the rest of her trip, read a book, watch a movie, whatever it was, completely oblivious that during the 11 hours it took her to fly from London Heathrow to Cape Town International, she became the #1 trended item on Twitter. Media, celebrities, and thousands of people began following her story, began commenting on her story, and even the firm at which she worked had to come out and make a series of statements and press conferences denouncing the things that Justine had said in her tweet. In fact, it had become such a phenomenon that the hashtag #HasJustineLandedYet began to go around, and people were even daring some folks to go to the airport to take a picture of her when she landed at Cape Town International and turned on her phone and realized the Twitter storm that she had created in her oblivion, to see how her reaction was going to be, what her reaction was going to be, which of course somebody obliged. Poor old Justine landed and began to realize that her life had just blown up in the 11 hours that she spent on the flight. And it didn't take long, because given our narcissism that social media fuels, it didn't take long for jokes to circulate around the internet. Now, this story is a story partially about using social media responsibly, but it's also a story about culture. It's a story about how the world has changed. Our social order has changed in just a couple of hundred years, really, from only the elite in society being able to read to just about any half-wit who can half-spell getting his thoughts out to the world like Justin Bieber. This is your world. This is your world. You must understand it, and I believe CQ can help you. Now, for many of us who are concerned about God's mission in the world, and especially the biggest industry within missions, which is STMTs, short-term missions teams, sounds a bit like a disease, and sometimes it is, but where an average of $1 billion is spent annually, I believe that CQ has much to add. I'll tell you another quick story. A few years ago, 2012, Hurricane Sandy ripped through several communities in southern New Jersey. We followed the story very closely because our family, or my wife's family, lives there. Some of their closest friends had their houses obliterated during that tragedy. I recall a conversation that I had with a pastor friend of mine in the aftermath of the cleanup, because many groups from around the country had come to try to help churches and communities rebuild and just simply clean up after the disaster that had been left behind. And as he's telling me the story, he told me how he quickly became frustrated with the demands that these groups began to have for their own well-being during that time. Where were they going to stay? How close was it to the nearest Burger King? That type of thing. And as well as their desire to snap selfies of themselves in front of torn down houses and disaster zones. And he asked me during the course of that conversation, he's like, is this what we do overseas as well? And I told him that in my experience, it's all too familiar story. But it's not all bad, because I want to show you a clip next about our friends at a group called TIMS, who are doing a lot to raise awareness of the needs in Africa.
Literally millions of lives have been changed all throughout the world with shoes and glasses. But here at TIMS, we're on the lookout for what's next in the world. And what we found is that in rural parts of Africa, there's this one need that most people don't even know about. And we have solutions. Why we're excited to announce today, the next chapter of our online. You buy one $600 smoothie machine, someone in Africa gets a $600 smoothie machine. Who does that $600? Well, I may not understand how much they need this stuff, but, you know, give it a little bit. They'll figure it out.
Of the hundreds of smoothie franchises available, we found out in Little Africa there are exactly
Just like that, when we saw this smoothie machine, you know? And I just felt like we brought them something so important that they'll cherish forever.
Yeah, sorry, we took our relationship and we're on a break and one of the projects we were doing in Axley, we're going to go smoothie. And she said, I'll never forget it. She said, what's a smoothie? And we knew at that moment what our calling was. Dare you
once you feel that smoothie machine, all that is was on the way to take a milk ice fish cake.
Yes, that's water. And there's most people that have water. But pretty soon, Texas will be releasing 1-for-1 apples. One iPhone charge. 1-for-1 Thomason cave cakes. And 1-for-1 Pittsburgh Pie CCC tickets. Obviously, we're very excited about this new opportunity. We feel like together, we can revolutionize that and one Wildberry Mango's budget. It's our hope that you join with us and help us make this year the year that we blend that poverty once
Believe it or not, I once had a student that I showed this to in the class, and she said, wow, is that a real thing? Some people call it poverty porn, some people call it self-emissions, but I think our obsession with short-term projects without long-term thinking is worth reflecting on and perhaps offering a corrective for. So what do we do? How do we do STMT, global engagement, without creating long-term harm? Before I talk to you a little bit about that, I want you to consider the following African tale. Elephant and mouse were best friends. One day, elephant said, "Mouse, let's have a party." Animals gathered from far and near. They ate, they drank, they sang, and they danced. And nobody, obviously they weren't Baptist, and nobody celebrated more and danced harder than elephant. After the party was over, elephant said, "Mouse, did you ever go to a better party? What a blast!" But mouse did not answer. "Mouse, where are you?" elephant called. He looked around for his friend and then shrank back in horror. There at elephant's feet lay mouse. His little body was ground into the dirt. He had been smashed by the big feet of his exuberant friend, elephant. Sometimes, this is what it's like to do mission with you Americans, the African storyteller commented. It's like dancing with an elephant. Now, I have danced with some elephants myself, and it doesn't end well, I can promise you, for me or them. So, how do we improve? Here's the first thing I would say. Do your research. There have been a number of really good books written in the last 5 years which offer a much needed correction to the phenomenon of STMTs. David Livermore, Serving with Eyes Wide Open, Paul Borthwick's book on Western Christians and Global Mission, Effective Engagement in Short-Term Mission, edited by Robert Priest. Those are just a few of the number of really, really good resources that are out there today. We Are Not the Heroes, another one. One of the most important of these, though, I think, is Fickett's work, Corbett and Fickett's book, When Helping Hurts. And one of the many useful things in this volume that they speak about is this formula that you see there behind me, where they offer this formula which defines how we often see work in developing nations. And even the vocabulary that we use, while often innocent enough, often indicates a veneer of patronization that is not helpful and incongruous with the economics of the kingdom of God if we keep in mind what we saw in Revelation 7 yesterday. As an example, we think of people who are poor only in terms of material wealth. We hear it all the time. They only live on $2 a day, etc. The implication behind some of that thinking at times is for us to think that it's wrong for somebody to be poor. There is something wrong with that person. They need to be fixed in some way. Isn't it interesting that Jesus healed the blind and the sick, and he raised the dead to life, but he never made the poor rich? His indictments were more for those who abused wealth than those who didn't have any. In his seminal work, Serving with Eyes Wide Open, which is, for me, prescribed reading for any of my intercultural students before going overseas, Dr. Livermore speaks about some of these presumptions that are sometimes made by U.S. short-termers going overseas. In an article he wrote a few years ago called American or Americant, I have to say it differently, Americant, okay? He recalls an incident of a training event that occurred by U.S. leaders in Africa. And he recalls this incident that was reported to him by one of the local workers there. And interestingly, towards the end of that statement, he said that this local leader said, "We clashed over cultural issues from the moment he arrived until the last minute he left. I even told him he is terminally offensive in our culture. He said he's transcultural. He is not American but biblical in terms of his values. He never once asked to see anything that I had done, and that just made me feel like nothing we have is worth anything." Interestingly, in this particular training time, the pastors and participants were separately surveyed as to see how they found the training, and there were different patterns that emerged as a result of that. When they asked the pastors from the US who had come out to do the training how they found that the training went, these were some of their answers. "I was surprised at their hunger. I was surprised at their thirst. They were really hungry for this training. This training was outstanding. They were very hungry. I would even say more hungry than they are overseas, because they're looking for our effective ways and tools. They would just sit and listen. They didn't get up and go to the bathroom every 5 minutes or say, 'I need a break' every couple of hours. They were enduring heat and humidity, and they didn't get up and leave. I think they were spellbound." The local pastors who were asked their impressions of the training made some of the following statements. "It was a nice day, but I don't think what they taught us would ever work here. But if it makes them feel that they can help us in different ways beyond supporting our ministry financially, we would like to listen. I'm glad the trainers felt respected. They should. But what they need to realize is that we would never think of talking or getting up in the middle of their lecture. It would be repulsive to do that to a teacher in our culture. I wish we had been able to share more about the real challenges we face in our ministry. How do I lead a church where most of our godly men have lost their lives at battle? How do I help a parent care for their AIDS baby? These are my pressing issues, not growing my church bigger or starting a second service." I didn't get that whole discussion. So my point here is not to call for a cessation of STMTs, maybe a moratorium, but rather an upgrading of the systems that we use and how we engage with God's global expression of the church. After all, 1/4 of the world's Christians now reside in Africa. So who are we really to say that we are going to teach 1/4 of the world's Christians? Maybe they can teach us. When I think of my own heritage and my own homeland, my parents are from both born in London, England, both English. And I look at my heritage in England, the home of people like Charles Spurgeon and C.S. Lewis, of John Knox and C.T. Studd. But now, except for a few bright shining lights, it is a nation that has largely turned its way away from God. Maybe some of those early indigenous works that began in places like Nigeria could now go and take the gospel from the rest back to the West. So these are some important things. Before we end our time this morning, I want to just quickly, briefly introduce to you how CQ works. As I said, CQ is your ability to function effectively across various cultures. It is a competency-based diagnostic. How do we measure this? Well, we as CQ facilitators essentially look at your proficiency in these 4 quadrants. We look at your drive, which is your interest and your confidence to adapt to different multicultural situations. We look at your knowledge, your understanding about those cultures. What do you actually know about them? And then your strategy, your awareness, your ability to plan for these situations intelligently. And then lastly, your action, your ability to adapt when relating and working interculturally on the fly as things happen. And so if you were to think of it as from a 1.0 to a 5.0 scale, a 1.0 is somebody who simply is like a giant amoeba. Things happen to them and they just happen to respond. That's kind of how they work. 5.0 is somebody who things happen and without even really thinking about it, they know automatically to adjust their style, the amount of personal space they give somebody, the way in which they would shake their hand or bow, etc., etc. So even though these dimensions are interrelated, they are integrated as well. And the good thing about CQ is, unlike your IQ, it can always be improved. You can grow in your understanding of CQ. And so tonight I'll actually spend a lot more time unpacking how the diagnostic works. So if you're interested and available to come out for that talk, I'll explain in a lot more detail about what we can actually do to help you improve. But now that I've given you a very brief definition of these 4 quadrants, I'm going to give you a test. Are you ready? You ready for exam? We don't let you out the room unless you pass the exam, so better pay attention. I'm going to show you a clip. And in this video clip, I would like you to rate how the male participant in this clip does in terms of his overall CQ rating. So if you were to rate them from a 1 to a 10, what kind of score would you give the male participant in the following clip?
You said, huh?
Yeah, definitely, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
There you go.
Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I'm born.
Before I was born.
Where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was either Japanese or Korean. No, I was leaving to go for Korean.
Amazing.
Kamchaku. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue. Actually, it's really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
So where are you from? Really? You're Native American?
No, but oh, well, it was my grandparents were from England.
Oh, well. Your people's relationships are amazing. Where? Let's see if we can.
Okay, so I'll give you a brief moment. Consider this person's score. And then turn to your neighbor and see if they had a very similar score to you or not. So all that to say is that culture and our understanding of how to deal with different types of people is an imperative. It's probably safe to say that in that clip, his action and his strategy was pretty poor, his knowledge was rudimentary, but we might, if we're looking for positives, say that at least his drive was pretty good. At least he stopped and tried to engage. And that's a good place to start. If you want to grow in your cultural intelligence, here's the most profound thing I'm going to say today. If you want to grow in your cultural intelligence, you probably will. But you need help. I want to close by saying that although I've tried to show you various facets of why the church needs to consider CQ in the past couple of days, I do also want to end with this. In the spirit of what we find in Philippians 2 with the humility of Christ, being humbled enough to humiliate himself as a human, And in the spirit of 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul says, I must become all things to all men, we must be humble. We must be humble. And we must learn. And we must strive and do whatever we can, short of sin, to further God's work in this world. And if that means I need to take a test, I need to grow, I need to take a step back and do some research, we should be willing to do that. It's been a blessing to be with you. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for the lecture and, of course, the video clips. Let's start off with your CQ rating for our video clip. How'd the guy do?
I'd probably give him about a 2. He showed some drive, but that was pretty much all he had going for him.
Good. Can we get the text slide back up? Okay, so we've got a few minutes for your questions. So if you want to throw them out, we can let Dr. Meekins look at them. So explain to us why you gave a 2 to that video clip. I think we all kind of intuitively felt awkward about it. It was wrong. But explain what is wrong. What in your perspective should have done?
Sure. I think if you look at the quadrants, it starts off with drive. So as I said at the end there, if you want to grow in your CQ, you probably will. So he demonstrated, at least at a very rudimentary level, an interest. So he saw somebody that he assumed was from a certain place, and he began to try to make some connections with food or with geography or things like that. Now he got it wrong, which is where his action and the strategy were pretty poor, because he didn't actually know a whole lot of what he was saying. But he showed an interest, which for me, I give people points for trying. At least you're making an attempt. That's better than just not engaging and not being interested at all. So, but surely from a strategy point of view, he was pretty offensive, and from his action point of view as well, he didn't really show a lot of knowledge and understanding. So,
good. Returning to the social bias from yesterday.
okay.
We touched on it briefly.
Yeah.
Many of us, I think, would find ourselves kind of relating to this guy. We see somebody who seems different from us, and we're trying.
Yeah.
But then, of course, we can fail awkwardly. Or we can be the other way around, where we have a false sense of colorblindness, where we see everybody kind of as this amoeba of humanity. So, can you talk about that? Like, where are our biases? What makes it a bias versus something where we're honoring diversity and trying to celebrate the differences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there is a continuum there, right? Bias versus appreciation of diversity. I think, first of all, when it comes to bias, it's unavoidable for us to have them. So when we see somebody, we automatically view them through a certain lens. So I'll give you myself as an example. So in occasions that I've done trainings and stuff elsewhere here in the US, I've flown around a little bit, and quite often I'll travel with some friends, one of whom is from South Africa, but he's of Indian descent, all right? So even though we're both from the same country, he will always get flagged for extra screening. I never do. And so when people even begin to talk to me, they will talk to me thinking that I am American. Only to find out when I open my mouth, they're like, oh, you have an accent. And I'm like, no, you have an accent. And then we kind of go back and forth for a little bit. So we have those biases, and it's not like we can extricate them from ourselves. We can't just become a blank slate. But it's allowing those biases to be examined and rooted out when need be for being factually untrue. I think I shared the story in one of the contexts I was in, but I had one of my students who came to my office quite excited actually, and sort of saying to me, I just realized for the first time that it's inappropriate for me to talk to people who are of Hispanic origin and label them as Mexican. Now he literally was like, this was a light bulb moment for him. He's like, so we shouldn't call everyone who is Hispanic Mexican? Like, no, we shouldn't, because guess what? They're not all Mexicans. So only people from Mexico we call Mexicans. Everyone else we call them something else. It's like, so I think that just reveals to him it was an honest attempt to say, oh, okay, so I'm acknowledging a bias and correcting that, and that's huge. So I think that's where we go from blind ignorance to appreciation.
Good. Several questions surrounding the short-term mission trip team.
Okay.
I'll phrase it this way. What is a productive or a helpful short-term missions trip?
That's a good question. I think it depends, right? So I think by and large there are, well, let me put it this way. Studies have shown that the two most common places for missions trips outside from U.S. students and high schoolers going outside and doing missions trips, the two most common locations is Canada and Mexico. Now, you look at both of those countries, right? They have churches. They have a well-developed expression of the church in both of those locations. And yet, very often, the people that are going to do those trips, they talk about doing door-to-door evangelism when they can't even speak, Spanish, which is a little awkward. They speak about church planting endeavors and things like that. And I think we probably need to go beyond that now. I think we need to look and say, okay, so how can we be a productive help to God's expression of the church in this location? And some of that is theological. I understand there's a tension there. So who do I want to collaborate with, who I don't? But that's a different discussion. But I think our purpose needs to be recalibrated somewhat. So a productive missions trip for me is one that is deeply informed by the needs and the context of the people. Ideally, it is a response to a need that has been articulated to the senders. So this is what we'd like you to do. I received short-term missions trips for a decade, twice a year for 10 years. And I don't think all but once in that time did a team ever ask me what they could do, what was the best time of year for them to come, how many people do I need, all those kinds of things. And they would generally come in the summer, the US summer, which makes sense, right? Because that's when people are on break. For us, it was the middle of winter. It was the absolute worst time for people to engage in short-term missions. The weather was lousy. People didn't go outside. It was 50 degrees. Who goes outside when it's 50 degrees, So, nobody wants to be involved in anything, and yet these teams would come. So that, for me, is a very simple example of, well, you're coming when it works for you, but not really when it works for us. So who is this really about at the end of the day?
No, very good. Several of these questions kind of grapple with, are we trying not to offend primarily? And then what that looks like when you're specifically evangelizing or preaching the gospel. Where do you, I think it seems to wrestle with the whole notion of politically correctness. Where does that stop? Where does it start? When you're preaching something that's offensive, you pull back. How do you think through those things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we know the gospel is offensive, right? So it is a stumbling block to the Jews, that type of thing. So we understand that when we speak the truth, we can expect opposition, and that's okay. I think if the opposition is more to how we're presenting it than what we're saying, that's the problem. So how do I know? That's really the key. Like, how do I know if it's coming from me, and how do I know if this is just they're offended by the message and not the messenger? For me, a big key to that is to allow that to be worked out contextually by locals who are there on the ground. Missionaries too, and I'm not knocking, I mean, some of my closest friends and mentors are missionaries, okay, so I'm not knocking missionaries at all. But they also looking at from an outsider's point of view. No matter how much time they've spent there, they are not Mexican or Canadian or whatever. They are still American. So even better would be to go to the locals themselves and say, okay, so how do you talk about the gospel in this situation? Like, how do you present that? What is the best way for us to do that? And then mimic that.
Good. Okay, there seems to be a lot of sympathy for the gentleman in the video.
Okay.
So let's think about it this way. what are ways in which you can engage someone who at least seems to be different from, in a way that is culturally sensitive, shows genuine interest, without crossing this line into pandering or offensive and those kinds of things?
Yeah, well, like I said, there's a lot you can do with somebody who has a CQ drive. That really is even though those quadrants are interrelated, that really is where it begins. So if somebody's saying, look, I'm going over here, I don't really care what those people think, I don't care how they do things, I don't like the way they do dress and eat food, I'm just going to go there and preach the word. I get a little bit, I get hives and I get kind of a little bit tetchy about that, because I think that's probably going to be terminally offensive. But if somebody's saying, hey, I understand that things are different between us. Like, as he was saying in the video, I kind of like this food and I've tried this, and you can do a lot with somebody who's trying. And then, so for a guy like him, if he was one of our students, I would say to him, okay, great. So now let's take your verve and your passion and let's school you a bit. So let's help you see that you probably shouldn't look at somebody and just think they're automatically Japanese or Korean. Okay, so there's kind of a whole continent there that you should be aware of. So let's talk to you about some geography. Let's talk to you about some cultural history. Let's talk to you about some religious aspects that are important. And if that person is teachable, which it seems like he was, then there's a lot you can do with that. So, yeah.
All right, last question.
Okay.
And maybe a bit of a teaser for tonight.
Yes.
Give us one thing that we can all do today, this weekend, this week, to improve our cultural intelligence.
Yeah. I would say one of the best things you can do, if you are thinking along these lines and you're saying to yourself, I need to improve my ability to understand myself. I need to have my biases exposed, etc. Especially for students, I would say one of the best things you can do is find a mentor who does not look like you. Okay? Find a mentor who does not look like you. Find somebody who is someone of the faith, someone who is a wise individual, who can help you understand some of these things, and ask them to teach you. The problem is, we often talk about cultural diversity and sort of the political correctness of it, and we ask people who are like us to tell us about how other people are. It doesn't quite make sense. Like, go to those people and say, teach me, help me, show me, guide me. So that's one of the best things you can do. Failing that, if you might say, hey, listen, I look around, I don't see anyone like that. That could be a separate issue, but failing that, read people who are different than what you are used to reading. So there's a lot of good material out there written by people who are those types of people, so you can learn from them through their literature.
Great. Will you pray for us?
I will, yes, thank you. Our Father, we are so thankful that you have given us this wonderful mission that we can be a part of, that as you begin to restore people to yourself, as you continue to reconcile your children to yourself, that you do so in every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, that you do so in ways that are beyond even our comprehension, and yet you choose to use us in that mission, in that task. And we ask only that you would give us great wisdom and strength as we do that, as we represent you in this world, as we are your ambassadors in the society. May we do well at that. May we excel at that. Help us, Lord, to do everything that we can to get ourselves out of the way for your message to shine through, for your Spirit to break through the sin that so easily entangles, and to free people from the bondage of that, to come into your marvelous kingdom and your marvelous light. So, Lord, help us, equip us. We are weak, very often we are frail, and we just ask that you would help us as a community of God's people, help the students here at Clearwater and the faculty and the staff to work together for this great opportunity we have in our time to serve you with everything that we have. It's a privilege to serve you, Lord, and we thank you for this in Christ's name. Amen.